Various politicians and celebrities regularly demand more trust in science and a greater recognition for researchers. This often goes hand in hand with the idea that science should be given priority over other areas of society, as it is the only discipline that is both undogmatic while at the same time ensuring technological progress and prosperity. We are also often told to ignore or even fight everything unscientific. Critics of the scientific method should not be given a stage for their absurd ideas, and we should instead listen to professors, academics, and experts when making political decisions. In this video, I'll argue that such a sentiment is dangerous. Not because I don't like science, but because, in my opinion, science is heading towards a major crisis, and much of the current research is unusable at best and fraudulent at worst. Ironically, there is both scientific evidence of a science crisis as well as political and economic evidence that something is wrong. I would like to address all of them in the next few minutes and at the end offer a number of solutions that can be used to address this problem. Part 1. The Crisis Explained. Okay, where do I start? Since the idea of a science crisis might seem new to you, you are likely skeptical about what I have to say, as you should be. So what exactly do I mean when I say science is in a crisis, and what evidence do I have to show for it? To help me make the extent of the science crisis clear to you, I would like to start by defining the term science. Every discussion needs a clear definition of what exactly we are talking about. The National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. states the following. A scientific theory is an informed explanation of the natural world based on a body of knowledge that has been repeatedly confirmed through observation and experimentation. Scientists create these theories from hypotheses and then collect evidence to test their accuracy. These findings are of an inductive nature and do not make any apodictic statements. Instead, they target predictive and explanatory power. If we take a closer look at this somewhat convoluted definition, we can identify the three cornerstones that are essential for the scientific method to work. 1. All knowledge is based on theories and hypotheses. These are nothing more than formalized ideas that someone thought of at some point. 2. For these theories to become scientific theories, they have to be repeatedly tested through the use of experiments. Paying homage to Karl Popper, it must be said that the experiments are not about confirming the theories. Instead, their goal should be to refute or falsify them. Only when this falsification is not possible can a theory be considered valid. 3. This also means that a theory has no claim to truth, but only reflects the current best state of knowledge. So in summary, the essence of the scientific method is all about coming up with a whole bunch of theories and doing your best to refute them through various tests and experiments. A theory that passes these tests can then be used to explain the world around us and maybe make predictions about the future. Let's now get into why I believe our current way of conducting science is flawed, and why many supposedly scientific disciplines and theories do not live up to their own standard. A good place to begin is the replication crisis. There is increasing evidence that more and more scientific findings are based on studies that cannot be replicated, meaning they cannot be repeated with the same results. Many of these studies have been published for years and are often used as proof of the author's theories, or even as proof of the effectiveness of certain medication. More on that later. The first discipline where this became a problem was psychology. Throughout the 2010s, more and more researchers noticed that they weren't able to successfully replicate their colleagues' experiments. This, of course, called into question a number of psychological findings, some of them quite famous, and part of textbooks around the world. I'm talking about things like ego depletion, where you have a limited supply of willpower that can be exhausted, or the facial feedback hypothesis, which states that smiling makes us feel happier. Many of these phenomena are based on only a few, or sometimes just one study. So when these studies cannot be replicated, it undermines the credibility of the field of psychology as a whole. Unfortunately, this didn't stop the authors from using their theories to sell books, give TED Talks, and influence college curricula. But the biggest scandal came in 2015 with the so-called Reproducibility Project Psychology, where an international team of psychologists got together in an attempt to replicate 100 research results that had been previously published in prestigious journals. Well, the team was only able to repeat about 40%, so less than half, of experiments with the same results. This then led to other replication projects like the Many Labs project, which found a replication rate of 50% when it repeated 28 psychology experiments. Now you might think that this problem exists only within psychology. Sadly, the track record of many other disciplines isn't much better, with the humanities and the social sciences, especially medicine and economics, appearing to be most problematic. For example, a 2016 anonymous survey of 1,500 scientists found that 70% of them could not reproduce at least one experiment by another scientist, and even 50% said they could not repeat one of their own experiments. In addition, 2% said they had falsified a study at least once, and 14% said they knew someone who did. So what gives? Why are so many studies unreplicable and therefore misleading? One of the most important reasons is probably the so-called publication bias, meaning the preferred publication of studies with positive and significant results. This effect goes back all the way to the 1950s and leads to the result of a study influencing the decision whether to publish or not. It has been shown countless times that less surprising research mostly disappears, while studies with significant results are more likely to be published. One of the best-known examples of this are studies on antidepressants. Turner et al. Were able to show that of all studies registered with the American Food and Drug Administration between 1972 and 2008, 31% were never published in scientific journals. While the published literature contained 91% positive studies, that number dropped to only 51% when the unpublished studies were included as well. Such profound differences should raise doubts about the effectiveness of depression medication. Now, originally, scientific journals were the only ones blamed for this, as they have a huge interest in publishing spectacular results. Interestingly, though, surveys have shown that many researchers often censor themselves. Many times, they don't want to publish negative results as this might look bad on future grant applications, or they are aware of their own mistakes and don't want to share them with their colleagues. This ultimately leads to a distorted picture of scientific reality. On the one hand, sensational studies get ever more media coverage and attention, while on the other hand, critical studies or unsuccessful experiments are forgotten or not even published. The consequences of this can be seen above all in medicine. I have already talked about potentially lower than propagated effectiveness of many antidepressants. Studies that show no or only limited effectiveness of a drug are published less often than studies that confirm its effectiveness. In the long term, this inevitably leads to a wrong treatment of patients, since the assumed effectiveness and actual effectiveness of a drug do not match. But next to the problem of incorrect treatment, there is also the problem of incorrect diagnosis. Misdiagnosis was a huge problem throughout history. For example, until well into the 20th century, old age was commonly declared as the cause of death when no other cause could be found. In reality, of course, there is always a specific cause of death, usually something like a heart attack or a stroke. In the past, however, it was rarely possible to clearly identify these, as they are difficult to see from the outside. Nowadays, we generally assume that such diagnostic errors no longer occur or are extremely rare. We think that with enough time and lab tests, almost every patient will get a clear explanation of what is wrong with them. Robert Bransfield and Kenneth Friedman, both medical doctors, would disagree. In their article Differentiating Psychosomatic Illnesses and Medical Uncertainty, they state that the problem of misdiagnosis is much more common than many of their colleagues want to admit, mostly with dire consequences for the patient. Nowadays, pseudo-diagnoses such as old age aren't as common anymore, but doctors can still use other specific terms when they have no idea what's making their patients sick. Above all, according to Bransfield and Friedman, these terms are stress and psychiatric or psychosomatic illnesses. They summarize the problem as follows. A psychiatric diagnosis cannot be given solely based upon the absence of physical, laboratory, or pathological findings. Medically unexplained symptoms, somatoform disorder, and compensation neurosis are outdated and inaccurate terms. Historically, there has been a bias in which poorly understood illnesses are often considered to have a psychiatric origin until the pathophysiology is better understood and explained on some other basis. Therefore, the list of conditions considered to have a purely psychosomatic basis keeps shrinking as scientific knowledge advances. Bransfield and Friedman primarily criticize the tendency of many doctors to quickly label complicated patients as psychosomatic instead of recognizing the limits of their own diagnostics and questioning their own competence. They are skeptical about the trend towards hyperspecialization because it contributes to a silo mentality where everyone is an expert in their own field but has little to no training in other fields and therefore isn't able to connect the dots and see the bigger picture. This dangerous overconfidence by all kinds of scientists is the very essence of my video. You can find them not only among medical professionals, of course, but also in many other disciplines. Again and again, well-paid experts are asked for advice and make predictions that are dressed up as scientific, but are basically no better than astrology. The best example of this was given by star economist Irving Fisher on October 17, 1929, when he confidently told the world that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. 11 days later, Black Monday ushered in the Great Depression. Now you could think that a lot has happened since 1929 and that economic models are way more precise today. Unfortunately, MIT professor Oliver Blanchard made the same mistake in 2008 when he proclaimed that economics are in good shape and that major economic changes could be foreseen well in advance. A few months later, the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression began. How widespread this expert blindness really was, shown by Berkeley professor Philip Tetlock in his book, Expert Political Judgment. For over 20 years, he collected predictions from scholars, intellectuals, and other recognized experts on social, political, and economic issues. The analysis of the data proved that the forecasts were no better than random predictions, and that experts rarely outperformed someone who had only casually informed themselves about the topic. A more serious finding, however, was that the accuracy of an expert's predictions was inversely related to their confidence. In other words, the more someone was convinced of a prognosis, the less often it occurred. Just like in the case of the replication crisis, this finding was most robust in the social sciences. Basically, every time the human factor has to be accounted for in a model. The serious consequences of such false confidence were highlighted by the misleading forecasts for the Trump election and the Brexit referendum, both of which were virtually impossible according to pollsters and most of the media. This led them to lose the trust of millions of voters basically overnight. The irony was that the forecasts were often sold as scientific consensus, which meant that any criticism of the polls was directly labeled as unscientific and therefore false. The word scientific became a sort of killer argument to silence opposing views. Okay, now that I gave you a quick overview of what the science crisis, let's go over to the second part of the video, the cause. How did this crisis come about, and why exactly is much of the recent research actually junk science? Part 2. The cause of the science crisis. In Part 1, I tried to outline what I believe to be the most important problem in modern science. The current state of research is vastly overestimated by both scientists and the general public. In medicine, economics, politics, and many other areas, we can really explain a lot less than we think. At the same time, many experts are unable and/or unwilling to admit to their own ignorance. Instead, pseudo-theories are created which are labeled scientific and then sold as critique proof. This, of course, raises the question of where it all started. Where do we find the root of the science crisis? In this second part of the video, I want to talk about some possible explanations. These are mainly based on my own experience across various universities and research institutions. This, after all, is where the greatest number of scientists work. The average scientist, for example a professor at a university, is usually portrayed as a selfless old man, motivated solely by his pursuit of knowledge and truth. Yeah, as you can probably tell by my sarcasm, this is complete BS. University chairs have pretty much the same hierarchy and dynamics as your average corporation. Up top, you have the CEO, in this case the professor, then come doctoral students and research assistants, and then the student assistants and tutors. Whoever wants to climb this hierarchy has to adhere to certain rules that aren't always spelled out but generally known by everyone. Besides building a strong network within the scientific community, rule number 1 is always to specialize in a certain field and to write scientific articles and papers. These are always written with the goal of publication in a scientific journal. The more prestigious the journals, the better. This makes sure your work attracts the greatest possible attention, which is measured in the number of citations by other authors. My point is that the image most universities and research institutes enjoy in public, a world free from competition and intrigue, is just not true. Instead, just like anywhere else, most researchers are motivated by self-interest and furthering their own career. One of the consequences is the publication bias, which I already mentioned before. Positive and attention-grabbing results are published more frequently, while negative results and boring replication studies are often rejected or disappear in someone's filing cabinet. This also leads to p-hacking, where test parameters are adjusted retroactively until you get a significant result. Since the significance of the results is basically forced into existence, the whole study is invalid. But no one will be able to tell without looking at the raw data. This brings me to another problem rarely talked about. When publishing studies, very few scientists share their raw data, which makes it almost impossible to correctly replicate an experiment afterwards. It completely contradicts the idea of the scientific method but doesn't seem to bother anyone in practice. For example, an analysis of 850 scientific, medical, and engineering journals showed that only 132, so around 15% of the journals have requirements regarding the publication of raw data, which, by the way, are easily circumvented. If sharing your raw data was mandatory, scientific fraud could possibly be detected earlier. Incidentally, the number of retracted and possibly forged papers is still increasing, which suggests that there are more black sheep among scientists than we are led to believe. As my final point of criticism, I want to address the peer review method. It is of utmost importance in modern science and assesses the suitability of a scientific paper for publication. Most journals use peer review and send submitted texts to independent reviewers. That way, the content and results of a study can be checked for validity and the integrity of science is ensured. At least that's the idea. As is so often, things look very different in the real world. First of all, you have to understand that most reviewers are under quite a bit of time pressure themselves and follow a certain pattern when going through a paper to save time. Therefore, the following is generally not checked unless there are obvious red flags. Statistics and static analyses. In other words, reviewers do not carry out calculations again. Examining the raw data. I've already mentioned this problem before. Repeating experiments. Instead, a check is made to see whether the text contains sufficient instructions to recreate the experiment if necessary. However, it would be too time-consuming to do it again and is therefore not required. Conflicts of interest. Also, the hyper-specialization of scientists means that there are only a handful of suitable reviewers for any given research area. And the lower the number of possible reviewers, the more likely you will encounter dogmas, groupthink, or nepotism. By the way, everything that I mentioned so far is nothing new, and most people within academia are aware of it. It's just that very few come forward and try to draw the public's attention to it. John Ioannidis is one of these lone warriors who did. He is a Stanford professor, and himself a member of the editorial board of several professional journals. In his 2005 article with the provocative title, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, he criticizes the ability of reviewers to use the anonymous peer review process to their own advantage and suppress research which runs counter to their own work. That way, false dogmas can be maintained for years within a research field. He also points out that studies are more likely to produce incorrect results. The smaller the sample size, the greater the financial and other interests, and the greater the prejudices within a scientific field. I wholeheartedly recommend his article to anyone interested in the topic. Before I move on to the third part of this video and make some suggestions for possible improvements, I would like to use a few examples to show the strong influence bad science has on our lives. All examples are drugs or medical recommendations, the effectiveness of which was based on studies that later turned out to be false, misleading, or even falsified. First is the drug Lorcainide. It was created for the treatment of irregular heartbeat. However, shortly before Lorcainide was launched, a study by University Hospital in Nottingham found that men who took the drug died significantly earlier than men who were given a placebo. Unfortunately, the scientists involved in the study had great problems publishing their results. John Hampton, one of the authors, later wrote, "On completing our study, we tried to publish our results. Full of enthusiasm, we started with The Lancet and then tried 2 or 3 cardiology journals. The result was always the same: immediate rejection. So Lorcainide went to market anyway and was prescribed en masse by cardiologists. Of course, based on the idea that it was scientifically proven to work. It is estimated that up to 100,000 people died prematurely this way in the United States alone." The second example is about beta blockers. For a long time, it was common practice to give patients beta blockers to lower blood pressure during certain operations. It was believed that these drugs would reduce the risk of death during surgery. This assumption was based on research by the Dutch doctor Don Poldermans. However, Poldermans was fired in 2011 for fraud and scientific misconduct. His beta blocker thesis came under fire, and new data showed that the drugs actually cause a 27% increase in deaths. It is believed that up to 10,000 deaths have been caused by his falsified data in the UK alone. A third example are saturated fats, which fell into disrepute in the 1990s because they were believed to cause heart disease. As a result, the American Heart Association changed its nutritional guidelines and recommended a low-fat, high-carb diet. In the following years, however, this led to enormous weight gain in the average population, along with higher diabetes rates, poor blood work, and an increase in heart disease. Exactly the opposite of what they wanted to achieve. The reason for this was relatively simple. The dangers of saturated fats were vastly overreported, while the danger of simple carbs like sugar was underreported. Butter and eggs were labeled killer foods, while fat-free muffins and cookies were fine. The last scandal I want to talk about is that of the German anesthetist Joachim Bolt. He falsified his own data to prove that a certain type of IV drip posed no risk to patients. Bolt convinced dozens of doctors to use the drip for years, causing an estimated 20,000 deaths. Of course, all of these are very extreme examples, and I don't want to suggest that all scientists are criminals. Instead, I wanted to show how much public perception deviates from reality. Scientists are not angels, and the pursuit of truth is often not their top priority. They too make mistakes and fall victim to biases. All of this is, of course, only human and would be normal in any other discipline. The problem is that basically every scientist will tell you how objective and impartial they are. Their job relies on being perceived that way, as a representative of truth, so to speak. Nowadays, the term scientific is often used as a hammer to end a discussion and silence critics. Politicians consult with experts to base their decisions on supposed facts. They don't realize that in those disciplines where human action has to be accounted for, as in economics and psychology or medicine and history, we are able to explain a lot less than we would like. Study results are often not replicable or only hold up under very specific conditions, as scientists have to break down multi-causal events into monocausal explanations in order to make them measurable. That way the big picture is often lost, and you no longer see the forest for the trees. Hyperspecialization also leads to more work in silos and less awareness of other disciplines. This reduces the effectiveness of the scientific method, which is rooted in the possibility that anyone can criticize anyone. Part 3. The solution. That brings me to the third and final part of this video, the solution to our problem. What can we do to improve modern science? Let me give you some food for thought on how to minimize misconduct and bad incentives within science. Because however prone to misuse it may be at the moment, science is still our best bet to more knowledge and innovation. Our goal should not be to discard all scientific achievements. Instead, we need a better basis for more valid research and less fraud. Here are a few ideas how that could be achieved. More skepticism towards scientists and academic institutions. In our modern world, there is simply too much knowledge for any single person to fully understand everything. This leads to more and more specialization in almost all areas of life, and of course in science. I already explained how, with hyperspecialization, the opportunities to deceit and cheat also increase. How often do you hear that researchers are at the brink of curing cancer, or that a massive breakthrough or world-changing innovation is just around the corner? Most of the time, these claims turn out to be strong exaggerations, and most of the time you can already feel the hyperbole beforehand. But because the average person lacks the necessary knowledge and authority, many scientific claims are impervious to widespread criticism. That way, the general public is becoming more and more of a passive observer who has no choice but to believe an ever smaller group of experts. Keep in mind that almost every expert, scientist, has an incentive to greatly overstate their research's impact, because publicly admitting that not much is happening in one's own field would mean a freeze in funding the next day. Unfortunately, the image of the selfless scientist, whose only concern is the pursuit of knowledge, never really existed. Accordingly, we as a society should stop romanticizing and be more skeptical of academic and other scientific institutions. Like any bureaucracy, without external pressure, they tend to grow larger, sluggish, and more inefficient over time. More data sharing. The current practice of not sharing raw data at all, or only sharing it when requested, slows scientific progress and helps fake studies stay alive longer. The only way of changing this is by increasing the requirements of journals, while at the same time reducing the cost of raw data provision. A survey by the Journal of Computational Science Education found that most disciplines, or even universities, do not have a central infrastructure for data storage and data sharing. As a result, studies and raw data is frequently stored locally on someone's hard drive, where it is disorganized and often lost. There is also a lack of standardized methods for creating and interpreting datasets. This makes it more difficult for other scientists to understand and repeat experiments later on. One good example of how data sharing could be done effectively comes from the field of astronomy. The large amounts of data from the Hubble telescope had to be collected somewhere, which led to the establishment of the Hubble Legacy Archive, where scientific data is stored centrally and can be viewed by everyone. Greater acceptance of replication studies. The examples of scientific fraud that I talked about earlier show the damage a single misleading study can do. At the same time, we know that many existing studies cannot be replicated by a new research team. Any policy decision based on such a study could turn out to be wrong in the future. At the same time, more and more people are calling for evidence-based policy based on scientifically sound data. But which politician, let alone which average person, is able to differentiate between good and bad studies? The only way to solve this problem is to drastically increase the number of replication studies so as to validate or discredit en vogue scientific models and concepts. The problem is that replication studies are currently associated with little prestige and funding. A possible solution would be a specified percentage of third-party funding that has to be spent on replication studies. In addition, the pressure on journals should be increased to make room for a larger variety of studies and not just those with positive results. Betting markets for study results. This last suggestion is probably the most interesting and comes from Anna Draber, an economics professor at the Stockholm School of Economics. The idea of betting markets for studies is relatively simple. A study whose result is questionable and should potentially be repeated is thrown in a pot with other similar studies that together form a betting market. Each study has a starting price of 50 cents and can be traded like a company stock. Participants of the market will then buy or sell the study, therefore influencing the price depending on how convinced they are of whether the study can be repeated successfully. For example, a share price of 0.87 cents would mean that a study has an 87% chance of repetition. In Draber's experiment, the exchange consisted of 206 students and professors from various departments, all of whom participated voluntarily. None of them were the authors of the studies traded. The result? A total of 63% of the studies had a price of over 50 cents, which means that the market assumed that 63% of the studies could be replicated. This estimate was very close to the actual rate of 62%. Draber's approach was also fairly accurate in determining the probability of individual studies to be replicated. In the course of further experiments, it was shown that her betting market was able to predict the replication outcome of 76 out of 104 studies. This is a success rate of 73%. Of course, such betting markets are by no means a perfect solution to the current replication crisis. Instead, they should be seen as an unconventional yet promising approach to uncovering scientific misconduct and fraud more quickly. And that brings me to the end of this video. Hopefully, I've been able to summarize my criticism of modern science well enough to convince you that not everything is as trustworthy as often portrayed. Last but not least, I want to end on a positive note. Because even if none of the suggestions for improvement should ever be implemented, there is hope. If we look again at the core of the scientific method, we can see 3 essential steps. Step 1, coming up with a theory. Step 2, testing the theory through experiments. Step 3, using the results to improve the theory. The limiting factor in all of these steps is time. Theories, models, and experiments do not fall from the sky. Only 300 years have passed since the Enlightenment, which marked the beginning of modern science. An extremely short time span if you look at human history as a whole. For example, Darwin published his book Origin of Species in 1859, so the theory of evolution has only been around for a little over 160 years. Penicillin, the most important antibiotic in the fight against bacteria, was only found 100 years ago. Each of these achievements represented a gain in knowledge that at the same time refuted or improved old theories. In retrospect, most previously scientific theories and practices might look surprising, funny, or even brutal. For example, until the 1950s, smoking behind the wheel was considered medically recommended because the nicotine kept you awake on long journeys. Even in the 1960s, some mentally ill were still treated with lobotomies, and until the 1990s, almost every building was insulated with asbestos. Most likely, our children and grandchildren will look back on us and our practices in the same way, presumably with the same amazement. The more time we allow the scientific method to do its thing, the better our understanding of the world becomes. It is not individual models, studies, or theories that are decisive, but the ongoing process that enables the critical observer to refute them at any time. The freer the marketplace of ideas, the sooner this future becomes a reality.